Hey, I'm Greg Porter, and welcome to the Maker's Quest podcast. If you want to find out more about Brian and I's YouTube channels and websites, check out makerquest.com for all the pertinent links.
All right, and I'm Brian Benham, and today we are talking about Betty Edwards' book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. This is a book that Greg recommended to me because I wanted to get better at drawing. And once I started reading this book, I realized that this book is more about not just becoming better at drawing, but becoming better at creativity.
Absolutely. And one of the things Betty shares it in her forward in the book, and it's in other places. And when I read the book for the first time 25 or so years ago, It so much of the book is about perception and looking at a problem from different angles, and she describes drawing as a logical problem that you can solve with logic and not necessarily having this magic lens on the world. I think even, she describes watching someone else draw as it's almost like magic. How are they doing it? It doesn't look like it should just happen that way. When you see someone who's really skilled at drawing, it does. It almost looks like a magic trick. And being able to break down how is this person looking at the world or an object or thinking of something in their mind and then translating that into a drawing. And the answer is there's some perception things that we aren't really taught when we're young. Whereas, I don't know, if you're learning to read, you learn the alphabet, you learn word structure and sentence structure and punctuation and all those things. There are very rigid rules to grammar and mathematics and things like that. Where in the art world, it those rules are never taught and they're not very apparent. And if you don't know what they are, it makes it very difficult. You know, you start drawing based on how you've seen other people draw, not how you're perceiving the world. And I think that's what her book does such a great job at, is altering the way you interpret your perception of the world.
Yeah, I and I one of the things that she really talks about in there is that it's a shame in today's society that school programs have closed down a lot of the art programs, a lot of the shop classes, and all of the ceramic classes and all of that stuff, and that she really hopes that people will start to really focus on drawing because she thinks drawing uh, focusing on things that you can see in the real world, like how do you draw that? Like if you're able to visualize it, you can see it, and you'll be able to problem solve it. So I think she's really onto something there, especially when I look at my own kids and how they are going through the world trying to figure out how to draw things or how to problem solve things, and to be able to look at the big picture and see, all right, this thing is going to fit into this thing this way, or this problem can be solved using this technique, is a really good skill to have.
Yeah, and I think the title of her book says a lot, right? Drawing on the right side of the brain. And so for those who don't know the right versus left premise of psychology, the basics of it are is that your left brain is very logic and language oriented, and the right side is where creativity and to some extent problem solving, which sounds like logic but it's different, problem solving, perception, and creativity lie. And what happens is we develop such strong language skills and strong logic skills that the left brain develops this massive amount of ability, and we don't spend enough time developing the right side of our brain where the creativity lies. And that's why the thing that I always giggle at, and it's not because anybody's a bad person or stupid or anything else like that, but put a pencil in the hand of most adults and ask them to draw their house. Right, as an architect, that is kind of a fun exercise to put people through, and their house winds up looking literally like something someone drew in second grade. And quite honestly, it's probably based on those hieroglyphics that we all learn. You know, the house with the two square sides, the roof and the chimney, and the puff of smoke coming out, with the stick figures holding hands that represent the family. And it's not because they're not smart people. It's because they haven't developed that side of their brain and the perception. And when you say the word house, it conjures a picture in their head versus a perception of what their house really looks like. And I think there's an important distinction there as we're talking about this book, to focus on the right side of the brain and what can the right side of the brain do? What are the capabilities there that the left side is completely incapable of? And I think where this hits home with most people is in the motor skills that we have, right? When I'm grabbing my bottle of water here, I'm not thinking about it from a language perspective. I'm thinking about it in a spatial arrangement of how far is that bottle away? How hard do I need to squeeze? Where do I need to lift it? Where's my mouth if I'm taking a drink? But I'm not saying those words. It's all happening. And interestingly enough, if you use a computer analogy, the left side of your brain is very serial. It's 1010, and it can only handle one thing at a time. And the right side of your brain is an extraordinarily parallel task type of organism, in that it can handle multiple movements from multiple limbs at the same time, and it can negotiate things. So the way that I've described it to people who aren't artists or aren't good at drawing, but they're definitely good at some things that involve very similar skills. And driving a car is one of those things, especially if it's a stick shift, right? There's a clutch foot, there's a gas foot, there's driving with one hand and shifting with another. You're doing four things in tandem, and you can't do that with your left brain. And that's why when you start driving a stick shift, no one can do it the first time. It doesn't matter how much coordination you have, there's no possible way you're going to drive it well in the first attempt. You have to start printing those skills in your brain, and your right brain takes over. And at some point you're not even thinking about gears anymore. It's a reaction, and that is a very right brain type activity. And I think all of us have probably had the experience where we're driving home or we're walking home out on a run, whatever it is, and you've been doing that thing for 20 minutes, and all of a sudden you flip from the right side of your brain thinking, being in that flow, over to the left side, and it's like, how did I get here? you know, you're all of a sudden your garage doors open, and you can't remember the entire drive home that just happened,
Yeah,
the
I've had
last
that
20
to
minutes
me
of your life.
many times.
And that's I guess why I'm walking into that is just describing that's the very different thing. Left brain to right brain is, your right brain is that flow state of you know parallel communication, many things going on, a lot of input, a lot of output. When you're driving, you're seeing, you're hearing, sometimes you're feeling things, if it's the way the car's reacting, and in real time you're responding to every one of those without really processing it through that language and logic side of your brain. If we waited on that, we'd have to drive 5 miles an hour. We could never go any faster because we couldn't process quickly enough. And when we're talking about art skills and creative skills, that right brain is where all of those things lie.
All the observations of observing what's going on and reacting to it. Yeah, so to tie into that a little bit, maybe a little bit of a shift gears, part of the reason why I wanted to better learn how to draw better is one, to better communicate, because I think it's a great communication tool, but also I wanted to try to become more creative. When I'm drawing in a CAD software, there's all kinds of things that are hindering my creativity and not allowing me to draw at the speed of thought. Like, oh, so that I've reached the limit of the CAD program, or I have to go find that shortcut key because I can't remember the shortcut key, or find it, the tool in the tool drop down box. So those kind of things just continually break my flow state. So I wanted to get better at drawing. And as I've been working on my drawing, I've realized a couple of things. Like, if when I first started out, let's say I was going to draw this pencil, drawing a pencil is pretty easy. It's got a tip on it and some couple of straight lines and a little circle on the end. So that you could draw that really easy. A kindergartner can draw it. But then as I continued to draw, I started to notice more things about it. I would notice teeth marks in the thing from me biting on it. So then I kind of started to draw those teeth marks in and notice the print on there, and the print was it pressed into the pencil, and so I was trying to draw the print in there, and then the little metal ferrule on there has lines that are crimped going in different directions. So one of them, I think, is crimping the eraser, and one of them is crimping onto the pencil itself. But then who knows what these other lines are for? So it got me kind of curious of why there's lines going vertical instead of horizontal, because they don't seem like they would crimp anything, and then maybe that's just to give you a better grip when you need to erase something. I have no idea. So just going through all this exercise got me to observe more about what's going on with the pencil, and also got me curious about why it's made that way and how it's made that way. Why are the crimp lines different, going in different directions? And then when you lay the pencil down, it has a shadow on it. So you start observing how the pencil is interacting with the world around you. So I think Betty Edwards is really onto something with um, teaching people how to draw is a great way to strengthen your creativity and understand your world around you and understand the built environment around you.
I agree. And interestingly enough, Betty has some really great exercises we all can do that get you out of that left brain and into the right brain to start observing things and really strengthen your perception of, I'll just say the world, but whatever it is that you're focused on that day. And her classic example of how to, it, your left brain and right brain fight for dominance all the time. That's just the way our brains work. And a lot of times, I'm sure most people have had this, where you start into some creative uh, activity, and then all of a sudden in your mind, and I keep pointing to my left side of my head, but it's just in your mind. It's sort of circular there, but in your mind you start going, why am I doing this? This is stupid. This is going to take forever. I got better things I could do. And you fight just the notion of starting to get creative. And her book talks about turning that off, turning that voice off, and doing an activity that forces you into the right side of your brain that you can't, the left brain can't fight back on. And some of those activities involve um, looking at things that you can't dissect the problem in any other way than to do it with the right side of your brain. So part of that is, making a different shape with your hand and starting to draw that. There are no words that describe the shape of what you're trying to draw. And so that's a really classic way for some artists to warm up, is they take an object or a thing, and rather than drawing a full pencil, because we all know the name of a pencil, and I can close my eyes and draw a pencil because I know the name of it, right? But like you said, if you just look at the ferrule of the pencil and start to draw that, there's no way for the left side of the brain to chime in and say, hey, I know the answer. Let's get through this exercise, right?
Right.
And so as you zoom in, or as you look at a shape that's not rectilinear, and you start to have to dissect that shape, it's amazing how quickly you will shift from the noisy outside voice of the left brain to the very quiet and industrious parallel tasking right side of your brain.
Yeah, she describes it as your left side of your brain being a bully and constantly telling your right side to be quiet, and what you have to say isn't important. We're busy over here doing real work, and your left side is just bullying your right side into submission. And so she has several exercises in her book, like turning something upside down and then trying to draw it upside down. And then that's forcing your left side of the brain to say, well, there's no logic behind this. There's no logical reason why we're drawing this upside down. And so your left side gives up, which allows your right side of the brain to then take over and allow you to draw this upside down figure and allow your creativity to start to flow, and allow your right side of the brain to dominate your left, because the left side says, well, this is dumb, we're giving up, and then turns off.
Yeah. And I think all of this is to say, Brian, the there is more importance in learning to draw than than the picture that you're going to put on the page. I think sketching, especially if you're dealing with clients in a design arena, whatever that is, if you're designing things that you have to get approval for from clients, the ability to sketch is paramount, and sketch quickly. That helps people iterate through ideas. It helps them see what you're trying to say. I can't stress enough how many times I've had a client and I'll be describing something architecturally to them, and they'll nod and they'll say, "Oh, yeah, 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 yeah." And you can see you can see them just glaze over in the eyes, and you know they have absolutely no clue what you're talking about. And again, it's not to be disparaging. It's not that they're unwise or they're not smart or whatever it is. It's that they don't have that visual practice that I and a lot of the people on my team have. And so to be able to pull out a piece of paper and sketch that thing, whatever it is that we're talking about, if it's a certain area within a building, if it's a layout of a building on a site, if it's some kind of weird access or topography that's complicated, being able to just very quickly sketch it and then, flip that paper around to them and say, "Here's what I meant to say." And, the light bulb goes off immediately. They're like, "Oh, oh, now I get it." And everybody's, maybe a little too embarrassed to admit that they didn't understand it the first time.
Yeah, I've
But
been there before on many job sites where I've been working with the general contractor and he's like, "All right, I want you to build it like this and with this reveal," and he's sketching it out and his sketch doesn't make any sense to me, and I've now I'm at a little more of a confidence level to be like, let's back up and like, can you explain this to me? But when in my younger years, I did not have that confidence level, and I left there going, what the hell am I going to do? I have no idea what this guy just drew.
uh, I've been there once or twice for sure. And sometimes it's my inability to change what I have in my mind, right? A lot of when you're a designer, I think, and you arrive at the thing that you're wanting to do, right? And putting it in drawings or handing it to somebody else in a physical sense, or whatever, and this puzzle piece has to fit into a bigger picture. And somebody says, "Well, I think we need to do it differently." A lot of times we have a roadblock or a little myopathy, if you will, a blind spot where we can't see a different answer because we know our answer is right. And that's a totally weird situation to be in as well. But again, if we can speak in a drawn language, it makes things generally easier if both sides can do it well. I know I've sat through a number of meetings where I've watched somebody sketch something, and it was really awful, and gone back up either to a whiteboard or a piece of paper and redrew it, and sometimes put a little perspective on it or make it three-dimensional and kind of ask, am I understanding what you drew? And then that leads to a little bit deeper conversation of, "Oh, well, that's pretty close, but what I really meant was this." Um, and again, I think that there's the sketching skill, which I think is extraordinarily important, especially if you're in in the design field. And I have a saying that I always tell our young people, and it's that drawing is design and design is drawing. And I think I may have even mentioned this before in our podcast. I sort of feel like a broken record sometimes, but it's good to talk about, because as you're drawing and you're making the drawing look good, that means you're making the design look good, because we're going to perceive it in real life like you drew it. And then, if you're working on the design and making the design look better, chances are that drawing is going to look nicer. And so it reminds me, at least the way I picture it in my head, is the pursuit velodrome races, where they start on opposite ends of the velodrome and they race as fast as they can, but they're not going to catch each other. That's drawing and design to me. You can't separate the two. They don't exactly touch each other, but they absolutely affect one another in every way, shape, and form.
Yeah, so a kind of a side tangent to that, I was listening to another podcast this week in Life of the Architect, and Bob Borson, the head architect of his firm or whatever, wherever he works, had an intern, and his intern had drawn something up in CAD, and Bob wanted him to change it, and he's like, I don't want to change it. And he's like, why do you not want to change it? And he's like, because I have like 10 hours invested in this 3D model. Like, I don't want to, like, I can't change that part. I'd rather change all this other stuff and keep the thing that I have this thing in. So he had this sunk cost fallacy into this 3D model that didn't really work or wasn't really what Bob was going for. And so Bob told him, like, all right, well, now you have to redraw that whole thing with just a paper and pencil, because that way you can't get that much detail into it. You have to just be able to get the basic picture out of what you want. The big picture of what you want was kind of what he was going for.
Well, I think that's another great point, Brian, in that we do become so reliant on our technology. And I think everybody who's ever drawn in a 3D or even a 2D program has experienced the same frustration with the software not doing exactly what you want. And then it becomes a battle of wills. Who's going to give first? Are you going to give up your idea, or is the software going to give up and finally let the screen look like what's in your head? And again, I stress, uh, I'm getting to be the old guy in the office. So that's why I always talk about our young people. But I stress to the young people how important sketching on paper is, because I can iterate through ideas with 3 layers of trace in a matter of a minute or two, where it's going to take them hours and maybe days to do the exact same thing on the computer. And you can, in Bob's from Bob's perspective, my guess is there was probably a piece of the design that just wasn't refined enough, or there was some mismatch somewhere along the way. And it's very easy to spot when you see it. But if you have that sunken time into the project, you don't want to mess with it. Well, if you work all that out on paper, your eraser is like really fast. You can just draw the lines back in. And if
Yeah, or
you
just crumple it up and throw it away and start again.
Yeah, and I had a professor, Tom McCoy. He was one of my favorite professors at KU, and he was the one who really taught me the art of trace paper and base drawings. And it was always this very, we've all seen those drawing books, how to draw a dinosaur, right? And you start with these circles and ovals, and then we add a little bit more detail and a little bit more detail. And Tom had this excellent way of drawing this base form. If it was a tower element on the corner of a building, he would just draw this 3-dimensional perspective rectangle, maybe with a floor line or two on it. And then he'd lay over a piece of trace and start putting some window detail. And oh yeah, that's going to look great. Well, maybe we'll move that to the side, and instead of one big window, we'll put two smaller windows with one big one underneath, or whatever it was. And he would iterate through this. And it was that magic show. All of a sudden, 5 minutes later, from 4 layers of trace, he had this incredible perspective drawing with shadow studies and everything else in it. And maybe there was a material, maybe it was brick in one version and it was stucco in another, and some kind of bat siding in another. And literally in the course of 5 minutes, this entire stair tower was designed 10 different ways. And that is an incredibly powerful tool, especially like you said, if it's an idea, you have to be ready as a designer to throw away more ideas than you keep. And I share with young designers all the time that if I throw away your idea and you get mad, you're no good at your job. You should be able to come up with 50 more iterations for that idea in a matter of 30 minutes or less. 50. And it sounds like an art, like there's no way you could come up with 50 different ideas how to do the same little thing. But once you try it and you realize that you can never look backwards again. And your first idea is your knee jerk. It's the easiest one, and it's probably the worst one. and and so as you, again, in the sketching world, as you overlay or draw multiple things on the same page, I've got sketchbooks full of pages of panels where there's just grids of the same thing over and over, but it's slightly different. And you wind up, sometimes it's number 4 or 5, sometimes it's number 30, but it's almost never number one. I can tell you that. So
Right. I have that same thing when I design things, and I try not to look at it as throwing the idea away, Just because that idea doesn't work on this particular project doesn't mean I can't save that idea and use it on a different project. And it's just a matter of remembering where I put that idea so I can recall it when I need to. And as I've been designing furniture for different clients, one thing that always do is I keep saving my renditions. So I'll just version one, version two, whatever. And then every once in a while, when I need come up with some new ideas, or have another client that's trying to figure something out that I'm trying to figure something out for, I'll go back through and open up all these files and look at what I've done in the past. And once in a while, I'll be like, oh, this would fit perfect for this client, and I'll be able to reuse that idea.
I think we all do that. There's definitely, I think design in general is a process of layers, and I love looking at, of all things, I'm not a sneakerhead, but I love looking at sneakers and how they're designed. And the shoes that are designed today, how many layers of texture and detail are in those sneakers? And if you rewind the clock to when I was a kid in the 80s, those didn't exist. Sneakers were very simple. They were either leather or canvas. And if they were canvas, they probably had some plastic toes and heels. And if they were leather, they were sort of leather with a flat bottom on them now. And now there's, multiple different types of material and meshes and stitching and pattern in the same shoe, and sometimes color. And the form of the shoe hasn't changed. Like, the form of our feet is the exact same. If you look at the envelope of the shoe, there's not much difference from today back 40 years ago in the 80s, but it's that layer of detail, one thing building on the next, building on the next. And I think, at least for me, when I look back at some of my sketchbooks and some of the ideas that I've had, it's always, my question is always, how can I add just a little bit more flavor to this one? Can I put a little more garlic or a little more salt or a little spice in there and bring it up one more layer of detail that's really going to add something cool to the next project? And I think you can tell in some designers' work that they don't learn as much from the last iteration, right? We should always be looking at that last thing as our starting point and build the next thing from that so that it's better and better and better. And I know I've heard you talk about it, Brian, your initial work and your joinery and some of the things that you're able to do. And I think you had a great story about a piece of furniture and a joint, and then your next one you built had a better situation, but you were like, "Well, I couldn't build it back then, but I can do it now." And I think that's what makes people's design careers very interesting, is that progression over time, whether it's a Frank Lloyd Wright or whether it's a Morphosis out in California or Frank Gehry or anyone else. You can see that progression through time.
Yeah, and just in your day-to-day life, trying to always iterate on your design and look at it from a different perspective is important. One of the projects I'm working on now has a geometric design in it, kind of based off the Fibonacci sequence, and then it has this circle that's embedded into this design. And I designed it in SketchUp on the computer, and of course there's a rotate tool on that, but it didn't dawn on me to rotate it. Like, the client gave me a specific width that I had to stay within. They said it can't be over 66 inches tall and 60 some inches wide or whatever. And so I had to design within that parameters. Now I built the thing and I got it all clamped together. And once it was clamped together, I needed to move it out of the way so I could build the second part. So I rotated it and turned it across the bench. And so now it's sitting in a different orientation, and I'm sitting here looking at this thing and I'm like, holy crap, that is way cooler sitting this way than it was sitting the other way. And I don't know, it may not be way cooler, but just my perception now of seeing it in a different orientation made me think, wow, I need to rebuild another one now for another client in this orientation. And that's happened to me a couple of times. I built a table that had the sculpted legs and it was three tiers. And then when I packed it up to ship it, I turned it upside down and I was like, huh, it works both ways. You could turn this table right side up or upside down. So, getting back to drawing, if I would have drawn it on a sketch paper, I could have spun that whole piece of paper around, and I may have seen that just by closing the sketchbook up, like turning the sketchbook over and closing it up instead of watching it on the screen where it's fixed.
I I follow a gentleman on both Instagram and YouTube, Mike DeTulo, and he he's a shoe designer. He's worked in industrial design, doing fashion. I think he's worked in the car world, doing just prototype design for cars, and all kinds of different. I'll call it appliances and things like that. So uh, some of the some of the speaker pods that we saw in the, I guess it'd be the early 2000s, that were these really cool modern or contemporary designed computer accessories. He worked on a lot of those things, and he puts these great speed drawing videos on his YouTube channel. And one of the things you'll see him do all the time is switch the image right for left. And Betty Edwards talks about turning the drawings upside down and kind of standing back. And it helps you look at proportion from an unbiased perspective, right? Again, we talked about, as designers, we become very attached to the thing we design. And I think as people who sketch and draw, as you draw it, your your faith in that drawing becomes stronger the longer you look at it. You're like, no, this is really a great drawing the
Right,
longer you
getting that
spend on
sunk
it.
cost fallacy.
Yeah, and sometimes when you flip it either side for side or upside down, you look at it and you're like, "Oh, oh, what am I thinking?" His left arm is way longer than his right arm, or just one of those things that'll stand out. It's like, "Oh, it's out of proportion." And I think, as people who design furniture or architecture or anything else, it's just as important to stand back at arm's length and flip something around the clock a little bit and ask yourself, is this the right way to look at this thing, or is there something off? And sometimes that inspiration comes from what I would call almost a mistake. You rolled something out of the way, not purposefully, to look at it differently, but you did it, and then it's like, whoa, 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 hey, let's let's take a step
Right.
back and look at this again.
Yeah, for sure.
Kind of getting back to drawing and perception and how that's valuable. And I think, obviously, we've talked a little bit about the sketching side and the drawing side, and it can be very pragmatic from a communication standpoint. But I think from a perception standpoint, it's interesting to me to look at our work with our tools. And I tell the people I work with all the time, I come home and I usually work in the shop at least an hour a day. I have a full time 40-hour, 80 hour a week, sometimes job. Um, and when I come home to unwind, one of the things I do is I go out in the shop and um, I work by myself. And you're working, at least I am, working on very three-dimensional objects, whatever they are. And that challenge is much like sketching your hand. When I get out in the shop and start moving boards around and the tools come on, and you start looking at all of these um, muscle memory type movements that we do, whether it's a table saw or whether it's a welding torch or anything else that I work with out in the shop, that left brain goes away in a heartbeat for me. And part of that is training. Like I'm used to it and I do it a lot, and I'm in and out of left and right brain all day at work. From, some moments I might be writing contracts, and then 5 minutes later somebody might be at my desk asking for help on a design, so we're sketching. So I'm in and out of it all the time. But I find when I get home at night, that's the one thing that my brain really wants to do, is turn off that left side and really focus a little bit of that right brain uh, thinking or processing. And it's interesting, as you start working, or at least for me personally, when I start working with a piece, um, how sometimes, yeah, I might have a sketch on paper, but I leave it pretty loose. But how quickly you can start to solve those problems as you're working with the actual piece. And sometimes you can sit and rack your brain sitting on the couch or at the kitchen table or at your desk, trying to solve a problem. But until you put the piece in your hand and you start working with it, sometimes you can't solve that problem in what I would call the best way. And it's always interesting to me how quickly I'm able to solve problems when I have tools in my hand. And even at that, sometimes how quickly I can solve the problem multiple ways and come at it from completely different approaches. And it's I don't know, my shop floor gets littered with, well, that worked, but it wasn't the best way to do it. and and sometimes, I've learned over the years that you have to commit. If you don't commit, you'll never know if it worked. But by the same token, once you commit, you have to be willing to throw it right in the bin if you don't like it. And if you're not, it's that sunken cost and, hey, I need to force this thing out. And sometimes if you're working on a commission piece and you're on timeline, you don't have that luxury of throwing something away and starting over. But like you said, you can go back to it and you can build it again and you can do it the next iteration, the next layer of detail, the next time you handle that piece.
Yeah, and put it in your back pocket for later. So, yeah, and then I've pulled out drawings years later, and I look at it, and I remember back to when I drew it originally, and I'm like, wow, this is really cool. But now years later, I look at it, and I'm like, that proportion is not, it's not good, and it's just because we're always learning and always growing, and our design tastes are always changing, just like our tastes in clothes from the 70s to the 90s, or the taste in hair from the 70s to the 90s. When we look back at our high school pictures and all the kids have foo-foo hair, and we're like, wow, that's what were we thinking back then? But back then that was just normal. We thought it was the coolest thing. So we're always just changing and developing and rewriting our brains into thinking new things and new thoughts. And of course, sketching is helping you rewrite your brain and getting your thoughts out and letting you keep moving forward.
It is, and I think I shared with you earlier before we hit the record button. I've actually taught the Betty Edwards method several times to groups of people. And when I share with them on day one, I think her first exercise is draw a self-portrait. Take a mirror, draw a self-portrait. And some of those things are terrible. you know, we learn to draw smiley faces when we're in grade school, and some of us never get beyond the smiley face. And you stare at yourself in the mirror and it's like, holy cow, where do I start? And your eyeballs look like footballs, and all the things you learned in third grade, right? And being able to tell people that sketching is a learned skill. You're not born. People have this perception, right? That you're either a good artist or you're not, and you can't acquire that skill. And sketching is very much just like anything else, like throwing a baseball or driving a car. It is a learned skill, and with practice, anybody can do it, and anybody can do it very well. And after 7 or so sessions of class and Betty Edwards, and kind of the final assignment is always draw that self-portrait again. And when you compare the two self-portraits with one another, and like I say, over the course of, call it, 5 to 7 days, somebody goes from an absolute infant in sketching ability to someone who can make a likeness to their face. Now, you're not going to be Picasso or, well, Picasso's probably a bad example. You're not going to be a Renoir after 1 week of drawing, but you definitely can lay the entire foundation and learn the alphabet of drawing in that amount of time. And I think that in and of itself, we talked a little bit earlier about opening perceptions. Once you've gone through all of those exercises to help you perceive the visual world differently, all of those locks are completely undone for looking at the world through that lens. And it's just amazing, uh, again, from my perspective, what that opens up from a creativity perspective.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to add to that about becoming more creative. You mentioned back when you're a third grader, you drew like this and drew like that, and some people never advance beyond that. And I think a lot of that is fear of being made fun of. Like
Mm.
when you're a kindergartner, everybody's like, "Yay, we're kindergartners now. We're fun. We're all just here to have fun and whatnot." But then as you get older, reality starts to set in, and people start to, people's personalities come out, and some people are a little bit more dominant in their personality. Some people get jealous, and they'll tear you down. or make fun of you or whatever. And I think that a lot of times will stifle people's creativity because now they're afraid to try. They're afraid to
Yeah.
put themselves out there. So I don't know what the answer is to that, but just another way of looking at it, like why people always think, "Oh, well, I'm not creative anymore," and I think it's just because you can't be afraid to put yourself out there. You still got to do the drawing, even if it looks terrible.
Yeah. And, something I bring up to everybody, Eddie Van Halen sucked at guitar one day. There was a
For
day he
sure.
picked up the guitar and he was awful. And he would have been in that same position. Somebody could have made fun of him for thinking he could play the guitar, but he couldn't. And he, just like everybody else, I think there was a certain amount of genius maybe with Eddie Van Halen that the average person doesn't have. But he had parents who were musicians and they encouraged him to keep going. And I think they probably helped his initial education probably progress quicker than the average bear.
Yeah.
but but he did. There was one day when he picked up that guitar and he had no idea what it was. And I think the same is true for generally anyone who you look at and you're like, wow, that person can draw really well. I'm kind of jealous. Or penmanship or anything else. I've been studying back into looking at calligraphy again. That was something I was obsessed with as a kid, and I've gotten obsessed with it again as an adult. But you look at these people who can do this gorgeous copperplate calligraphy, and you think, man, it's effortless. I could never do that. And after about 3 or 4 hours of practice, you realize that, yeah, you're not that far off from being able to do that. It's going to take some practice to get, you know, good enough to do it quickly and do it every time without mistakes. But you can definitely progress to a point, whether it's calligraphy or drawing or anything else. You can progress to a point of proficiency, I would say, fairly quickly. And it's amazing. Again, I'll go back to, 7 days of class, and all of a sudden you go from someone who can barely draw a circle with a smile and two eyeballs in it to someone who can draw something real from life or from their imagination. And it's amazing how small that hurdle is to get over.
Once you get started, is I think you were telling me a podcast ago, maybe it was before we hit record. Um, I can't remember the guy's name. He did a whole thing on surfing.
Oh yeah,
Um,
Tom Sachs.
Tom Sachs, yeah, and Tom Sachs is like, well, I'm going to go learn how to surf, and 80% of learning was done in 20% of the time, or something along
Yeah.
those lines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's his curve. And um it's that build up. You're terrible, you're a beginner is actually much shorter than most of us think it is. And then it's the really steep curve to mastery. And there's that mastery can take an entire lifetime sometimes. But then he had what he called the fun zone. And that was, you knew how to do it well enough to have fun doing it. And i
Yes.
think i think that's the point we're all after. We want to get to that. Once you get there, it's like surfing or golf or skiing or any activity that you do. Once you get into that fun zone, you look at the people who have mastered it and you want to get there. And the only way to get there is that 10,000 hours or 20,000 hours or whatever it is that we want to call it today. But drawing is definitely that. The 10,000 hours of drawing. I would tell you, from a sketching perspective, sketching is not a 10,000 hour mastery. I think it's more like a couple hundred, and you get pretty darn good at it. And then it's a matter of the artistic expression, I think, is where you start to see the mastery.
And find people's style. Like there's a guy, Andrew, I think his last name's Millicent. He's a Oregon State professor, and he teaches permaculture. And he's not drawing like beautiful self portraits of perfect people, but he's using his drawing skills to illustrate and teach permaculture and how the fields and mountains and all that absorb water and all of that stuff. And his drawings are really beautiful to look at, even though they're very simple. They're not highly technical, but they're just really well done and very beautifully thought out. And then there's this guy on Instagram I follow that he draws at such a high, precise precision level that it looks like a photograph. It looks like someone took a black and white photograph of him, and he's drawing himself as a self portrait. And that's just a totally different style and different way of drawing.
There's a great handful of videos on YouTube, and it's student videos from one of the classes at MIT. And I can't remember what the class is or who the professor is, but if you look up MIT professor drawings, you'll probably find it on YouTube. And it's somebody, he's teaching some kind of math, and he's drawing diagrams on the board. And he has this really cool way of drawing dash lines. As fast as he can draw a line, he can draw a dash line that has perfect spaces between the dashes. And it's a certain amount of friction on the chalk is what allows him to draw it. Like he draws uphill, but he has a ruler, and he uses this yardstick to draw the series of lines and graphs and grids and things. And it's some of the most beautiful uh technical diagrams that you'll ever see. And again, I think he made a conscious decision at some point in his career that he was going to provide these really great diagrams to his students, rather than, I think we've all watched math teachers struggle with the chalk and drawing sine waves or whatever it is that they're going to draw to teach our class that day. And he made a conscious decision to really dissect and look at how he was going to sketch those things on his chalkboard. So anyway, one of those treats that you run across on YouTube, going down a rabbit hole sometime when there's the list of videos you may want to watch on the right side of your
Right.
screen, that popped up one day, and it was just like, this guy's awesome. So anyway, little
He,
suggestion there.
he had his definitely had his style of drawing. So he had reached the fun zone.
He definitely had reached the fun zone, and his students knew it. That was what was great, is there was an acknowledgement from the students that, hey, this guy's different and pretty cool.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Awesome. So we started out talking about using drawing and creativity with Betty Edwards to solve problems. Has there been some crazy problem you have solved just like in a really weird creative way?
Oh my. uh I'm trying to think of an example. The answer is yes, but I guess I would say it this way. It, the the buildings I work with are extraordinarily complex when you look at all the systems inside. And I find that when you refine a design down and it starts to look simple, it starts to look effortless. And there's not a bunch of weird ins and outs and things that don't really line up and intersect. That to me is kind of the ultimate in problem solving. You've taken this completely irrational web of craziness and aligned enough things that it starts to look extremely rational, and that everything belongs where it belongs. It's way harder of a trick than it sounds like. And when you walk into a building that is very refined like that, it doesn't it, you think to yourself, well, their problem must not have been complex because it was solved so simply. And I think sometimes the most complex resolutions are those uh, simple iterations, or simple resolutions to the problem. And so, are there things creatively that I've solved through the right side of your brain and that type of thinking? Absolutely. I use it every day. And sometimes it's over the span of several months where these things start to get put together. And I would tell you that's where I use those perception skills that Betty talks about in her book every day to solve those problems. If you don't, I've walked into thousands of buildings where you're like, oof, this guy did not. It was out of control in this person's mind. Like it never settled down for him or her, or that team of people. or they just didn't ever address those things. And I know that's sort of a esoteric way to answer your question, but absolutely, I use those skills every day to refine designs into something that looks simple and elegant, but behind the scenes is extraordinarily complex.
A maze of prints over and over and over again, huh? Just
Yes.
electrical plan on top of plumbing plan on top of lighting plan on top of security plan on top of fire plan.
Yes, on top of code restrictions and user demands, adjacencies. I mean, you start to look at all those layers in a building, and quite honestly, it's a small team of people that design buildings. A lot of times, you know, an 80,000 square foot building might be designed by three people on the architectural side, sometimes two. And so it's a really small group of people that have to solve every one of those problems. Now there's engineers who design the systems, electrical, mechanical, and whatever else, but the architects are directing them to how those systems integrate with the rest of the building and the overall design concept. And that is, yeah, it's a long story problem, right? It's a story problem that takes you 3 or 4 months to solve, but hopefully when you do it, it looks good and performs well. And when it rains, you don't leak and all of those things. And it doesn't crumble when it gets a big wind load or a snow load on it as well. How about you, Brian, in terms of problems you solved that have been very complex like that?
Well, my example that originally came to mind or came to mind quickly was not complex at all. It's actually a very simple solution to a mistake. Um, I left one job site and I went to a new client's house to bid a bathroom remodel, and I left my tape measure on the other job site. So I talked to the client and what she wanted to do with her bathroom, and I was like, all right, well, let me measure it up. And I didn't have my tape measure, but I had my pencil, so I laid my pencil end to end to end to end across the floor of the bathroom and counted how many pencils it was wide, and so 12 pencils wide. And then when I got back to the office, I measured how long my pencil was and multiplied that by how many pencil wides it was, so I could create an estimate for her.
That feels very Egyptian to me.
Yeah, yeah, it was just like, oh, I don't know what I'm gonna do. I can't tell her like, hey, I gotta come back tomorrow with my tape measure because I'm an idiot. So that was just the solution to the problem. I just said, all right, I'm gonna measure this up. I shut the door and just counted my pencils across the floor and across the floor and around the countertop and figured out how much tile we needed, and yeah, worked
Yeah.
out.
Measuring in cubits or
Yeah.
or some other bizarre measuring unit. So yeah, I think we've done a pretty good job of covering the basics of the right brain type development that Betty Edwards talks about in her book. And for anybody out there that wants to, take their beginner level sketching skills to the next level, I would highly recommend Betty's book to anyone. Um, but yeah, we'll leave it there. I am Greg Porter.
I'm Brian Benham, and thank you for listening to the Maker's Quest podcast. We will leave a link on our website to Betty Edwards' book, and you'll also find links to my YouTube channel and Greg's YouTube channels as well, and our social medias, Instagram accounts, and all that stuff there too. Thanks for listening.